The ship of Theseus is one of the oldest and most fascinating paradoxes about identity, change, and what it really means for something to remain the same over time. The story begins with a simple question. Imagine a wooden ship used by the ancient hero Theseus. Over many years, this ship is carefully preserved by the people who admire him. But wood decays. So whenever a plank becomes too old or damaged, the caretakers replace it with a new one. One year they replace a few planks. The next year they replace a few more. And this continues again and again, until eventually every single piece of wood in the ship has been replaced. The question is simple yet incredibly deep. If every part has been replaced, is the ship still the ship of Theseus? On one hand, we feel tempted to say yes. After all, the ship looks the same, functions the same, and has been continuously maintained in the same structure. There was never a moment when the ship stopped being the ship. The change was gradual. At no point was it destroyed. So this line of reasoning says that identity stays intact because continuity never broke. This perspective focuses on the idea of form, function, and history. The ship's identity comes from the story of how it was preserved over time. However, on the other hand, there is an equally strong argument that says no. If all the original parts are gone, then the original ship no longer exists. What stands now is a perfect replica made out of entirely new materials. The paradox becomes even more puzzling when philosophers add one extra twist. Imagine that someone kept all the old planks that were removed each year. Then imagine they reassembled those original planks back into a complete ship. Now we have two ships, one built from new planks but maintained continuously, and one built from the original old planks. Which one is the real ship of Theseus? Most people feel confused at this point. The paradox works because both answers feel correct and both answers feel wrong at the same time. It forces us to examine what we value more, the physical substance of something, or the continuity and history of it. The deeper insight behind this paradox is that identity is not as simple as it appears. We often think things, or even people, stay the same over time. But nothing, not even ourselves, remains made of the same parts forever. Human cells regenerate. Memories shift. Behaviors change. Experiences reshape us. And yet, we still feel like the same person across our entire life. The paradox reveals that identity may not be about the materials we are made of, but about the pattern that stays consistent. Some philosophers argue that identity comes from the continuity of structure. Even if all the materials change, the overall form and function stay stable. Others argue that identity is anchored to the original substance. If the substance disappears, the thing loses its original identity. There is also a third viewpoint, which suggests that identity may not be a simple yes or no answer. Instead, it might be layered, relational, or dependent on context. The ship of Theseus invites us to see identity not as a fixed property, but as a flexible concept shaped by perspective. Modern thinkers connect this paradox to everyday life. We talk about whether a restored car is still the same car. We wonder if a person with fully replaced biological cells is still the same person from childhood. We even discuss whether a digital version of someone could ever count as the real person. The paradox remains relevant because it asks a timeless and universal question: what makes something itself? At its heart, the ship of Theseus teaches a gentle yet profound lesson. Identity is not always about the physical pieces. It may be about the story carried across time, the continuity of experience, and the meaning we attach to something. The paradox does not give a final answer. Instead, it gives us a clearer view of how complex, beautiful, and mysterious identity can be.
The problem of induction is one of the most important and unsettling ideas in philosophy, especially in understanding how humans make predictions about the world. At first, it seems like an academic puzzle, but when you look closer, it becomes clear that this problem touches most everything we do. Every belief we have about the future, every assumption we hold about nature, every expectation we carry through our daily life. And the problem suggests that none of these expectations have a solid foundation. The issue begins with a simple observation. Humans learn from experience. When we see something happen over and over again, we naturally start believing it will happen the same way. If the sun has risen every morning of our life, we expect it. If bread has always nourished us, we expect it to nourish us again. If dropping a stone always makes it fall, we expect stones to fall every time. This way of reasoning is induction. We observe patterns in the past, and we assume they will continue. Induction feels natural. It feels safe. It feels like the foundation of common sense. But the philosopher David Hume pointed out something shocking. He said there is no rational or logical proof the future must resemble the past. Just because something has always happened a certain way does not guarantee it will happen the same way. The sun has risen every day so far, but that fact alone does not logically prove it must rise again. It is simply a habit of expectation we have formed. Hume's questioning seems small, but the consequences are huge. Because induction is the basis of all scientific reasoning. Science looks at repeated events, finds patterns, tests, and uses them to make prediction. Every law of physics, every claim of biology, every rule of chemistry depends on the assumption that nature behaves consistently over time. But if there is no logical guarantee for that consistency, then our entire scientific worldview rests not on certainty but on probability and confidence. To understand the problem more clearly, imagine this. A turkey is fed every morning by a farmer. Day after day, the turkey becomes more certain that the farmer is friendly and that food always comes at the same time. The pattern continues for hundreds of days. Everything looks stable. Everything looks reliable. Then, on the day before Thanksgiving, the pattern changes. This example shows how observing the past does not always prepare us for the future, and it highlights the vulnerability of relying only on induction. Hume never argued that induction is useless. He believed humans cannot help using it. It is part of our nature. We depend on it instinctively for survival. But he insisted that induction has no logical justification. We assume tomorrow will resemble today simply because our minds are built to expect it, not because reason. Some philosophers tried to answer Hume. They argued that nature has uniform laws, and these laws ensure future behavior. But this argument quickly circles back to the same problem. How do we know nature's laws are uniform? Because they always have been, and that once again relies on induction. Others suggested that induction works because it has worked before. But that argument also uses induction to justify induction. It becomes a loop with no firm starting point. Modern thinkers approach the problem differently. Some say we do not need certainty. Instead, we can rely on probability. If something has happened the same way millions of times, it is extremely likely to happen again. Not guaranteed, but likely. This approach keeps science functioning, even without perfect philosophical grounding. Others argue that induction is not justified by logic, but by evolution. Species that expected patterns were more likely to survive than those who assumed total randomness. Despite these attempts, Hume's challenge remains. The problem of induction reminds us that certainty is rare. We operate on expectation, not proofs. And that is not a weakness, it's simply the condition of being human. The problem teaches us humility. It shows us that our predictions, even our scientific ones, rest on habits of mind and long chains of past observation. It also reminds us that change, surprise, and unpredictability are always possible no matter how stable the world appears. At its core, the problem of induction is not about doubting or rejecting, it is about understanding the limits of certainty. It encourages us to see our beliefs as strong, useful, practical, but not infallible, and it invites us to live with a mix of confidence and openness, knowing that the world may always contain some unexpected.
The tolerance paradox is one of the most important and challenging ideas in social philosophy. It explores a tension that seems simple at first, but becomes deeply complicated when we look closely. The paradox asks a fundamental question. How tolerant should a tolerant society be? And even more importantly, what should we do when tolerance itself is threatened by people who refuse to be tolerant in return? The paradox begins with the idea that tolerance is a virtue. Many societies value openness, respect, free expression, and the ability for different viewpoints to coexist. We admire the idea of letting people think what they want, speak what they believe, and live according to their own values. But the problem appears when we encounter groups or ideologies that do not believe in tolerance at all. These are groups that want to restrict others, silence others, or even eliminate the freedom of certain people. Now the question grows sharper. Should a tolerant society tolerate intolerance? It feels contradictory. If a tolerant society refuses to tolerate intolerant behavior, then some argue it becomes intolerant itself. On the other hand, if a society allows intolerant people full freedom to act, speak, and organize, those intolerant ideas may eventually gain power. And once they gain enough power, they may destroy the very tolerance that allowed them to grow. In this way, tolerance can end up enabling its own destruction. The philosopher Karl Popper explained this paradox clearly. He warned that unlimited tolerance can lead to the disappearance of tolerance. The reason is simple, but uncomfortable. If we allow absolutely everything, including the open promotion of hatred or oppression, then those intolerant ideas can spread unchecked. Eventually, they may reach a point where they can suppress all other ideas. Once that happens, freedom collapses, voices are silenced, diversity disappears. A system built on tolerance is replaced by one built on domination. This idea shows that tolerance is not simply about allowing everything without question. Tolerance requires boundaries, and those boundaries exist not to limit freedom, but to protect it. If a society wants to preserve a space where many ideas and identities can coexist, then it must be firm against those who want to shut that space down. The paradox forces us to consider which forms of intolerance are dangerous enough to justify being restricted. It is important to understand that the tolerance paradox does not mean shutting down every idea we dislike. It does not suggest banning harmless opinions or stopping people from expressing criticism. Healthy disagreement is not intolerance. Debate is not intolerance. Tough conversations between different perspectives are not intolerance. The paradox concerns a specific kind of intolerance, the kind that seeks to eliminate the basic rights, dignity, or existence of others. The paradox teaches us that tolerance is strongest when it defends the conditions that make tolerance possible. This can include protecting free speech, human rights, equality before the law, and the ability for people to live without fear. When intolerance threatens these foundations, society may need to act, not out of hostility, but out of preservation. However, the paradox does not give a perfect rule. It raises more questions than it answers. Where exactly is the line between disagreement and harmful intolerance? Who decides where that line is? How do we prevent the misuse of power by those who claim to protect tolerance but actually suppress criticism? These questions show why the paradox is not simply a logical puzzle, but a real-world challenge with moral and political consequences. The tolerance paradox also teaches us about human behavior. It reminds us that ideas have power. It shows us that kindness alone cannot stop harmful ideologies from spreading. And it warns us that silence in the face of intolerance can be dangerous. A society that values openness must also value responsibility. It must be aware that freedoms can be used either to uplift others or to oppress them. The paradox's lesson is both gentle and firm. A tolerant society should welcome diversity, protect expression, and cultivate dialogue. But it should not allow itself to be destroyed by those who refuse to live by the same principles. The goal is not to punish ideas, but to protect people. The goal is not to suppress difference, but to preserve fairness. The paradox invites us to practice tolerance with wisdom rather than naivete. In the end, the tolerance paradox encourages balance. It asks us to defend the space where tolerance can thrive, while being cautious of those who want to remove that space entirely. It shows that true tolerance is not passive, it is active, it is thoughtful, and it understands that freedom must be protected, not just assumed. Achilles and the tortoise is one of the most famous paradoxes from the ancient Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea. It appears simple on the surface, but it raises deep questions about motion, time, continuity, and how we understand infinite processes. The story begins with an imagined foot race. Achilles, the greatest and fastest warrior in Greek mythology, challenges a slow and steady tortoise. To make the race interesting, Achilles allows the tortoise a small head start, perhaps 50 meters. Achilles is confident he will overtake the tortoise quickly. After all, he is much faster. But Zeno argues something surprising. According to his reasoning, Achilles can never actually catch the tortoise. The logic goes like this. When the race begins, Achilles starts from the starting line, and the tortoise is already ahead. Achilles runs, and eventually he reaches the point where the tortoise began. But during the time Achilles spent reaching that point, the tortoise has moved forward by a smaller distance. Now Achilles must reach the new point where the tortoise has moved, but while Achilles covers that distance, the tortoise moves a little further again. Each time Achilles reaches the tortoise's previous position, the tortoise has already advanced, even if only by a tiny amount. This continues endlessly. Achilles is always closing the gap, getting closer and closer, but never reaching the exact point where the tortoise currently is. Therefore, according to Zeno, Achilles will never catch the tortoise. Intuitively, this feels absurd. In reality, Achilles would easily pass the tortoise in just a few seconds. But Zeno's goal was not to deny physical reality. Instead, he wanted to expose a problem in how we think about space and time. His paradox shows that motion requires completing an infinite number of steps. To catch the tortoise, Achilles must first reach the tortoise's starting point, then its next point, then the next, and so on, without end. This creates an infinite sequence of distances Achilles must cover, and because infinity cannot be finished, Zeno concluded that motion itself must be impossible, or at least logically contradictory. This paradox challenges our understanding of infinite division. If every distance, no matter how small, can be divided into smaller distances, then the journey contains infinitely many parts. How can Achilles complete infinitely many tasks in a finite time? How can motion occur at all if it requires passing through an endless number of points? Zeno's argument transforms a simple race into a philosophical and mathematical puzzle that echoes across centuries. For a long time, people struggled to answer Zeno. Some believed the paradox proved that motion was an illusion. Others argued that the infinite steps Achilles must take are not real, but mathematical abstractions. Still others said that time and space cannot be infinitely divided. But the most satisfying solution came much later, through the development of calculus and the concept of converging series. Modern mathematics shows that an infinite number of small steps can add up to a finite total. In other words, even though Achilles must pass through infinitely many points, the total time required to pass through them can still be limited. To illustrate this, imagine breaking 1 second into half a second, then a quarter of a second, then an eighth of a second, and so on. The number of divisions is infinite, but the total time never exceeds 1 second. The smaller the steps become, the less time each one takes, and the entire sequence converges. This means Achilles can indeed overtake the tortoise, because the infinite series of distances collapses into a finite time interval. Zeno revealed a genuine problem, but the tools to solve it did not exist during his life. Even today, the paradox teaches us something essential. It reminds us that intuition and logic do not always align. It shows that infinite processes behave differently from finite ones. And it highlights how mathematical breakthroughs shape our understanding of reality. While we know Achilles wins the race, the paradox invites us to question what it means to move through space, how time flows, and whether our everyday experience reflects deeper structures we often overlook. At its heart, Achilles and the Tortoise is a puzzle about how the mind interprets motion. It encourages patience with complexity and curiosity about ideas that seem impossible. And although mathematics has resolved the paradox in a technical sense, the deeper lesson remains. Sometimes what appears simple contains hidden layers, and sometimes understanding the world requires slowing down, stepping back, and seeing familiar events with fresh eyes. The lottery paradox explores a strange conflict between what seems reasonable for us to believe and what becomes unreasonable when all those beliefs add up together. At first it looks simple. A lottery has a huge number of tickets. Only one ticket will win. The chance of any particular ticket winning is extremely small. It is perfectly rational to look at a single ticket and say, "This ticket will not win." We feel confident in that judgment because the probability is so low. But when we apply this same reasoning to every ticket, we end up believing that no ticket will win at all. And that conclusion is clearly false. Someone must win. The paradox lives inside this tension between reasonable individual beliefs and an unreasonable collective result. Imagine a lottery with 1,000,000 tickets. You buy ticket number 74,000. You check the odds. 1 in 1,000,000. Rationally, you conclude that your ticket will not win. Now imagine your friend has ticket number 286,000. Different number, same tiny chance. So you conclude their ticket will not win either. You can repeat this process for every single ticket in the lottery. Each time, your belief is reasonable. Each ticket you consider has an extremely low probability of winning. But if you apply that reasoning consistently, you end up with the belief that all 1,000,000 tickets will lose. And that is impossible, because the rules guarantee that one ticket wins. The paradox appears because individually reasonable beliefs create a collectively contradictory belief. The lottery paradox raises important questions about rationality. What does it mean to hold a reasonable belief? Is a belief justified simply because it is highly probable? Or do we also need to consider how that belief fits with our other beliefs? The paradox shows that probability alone cannot always guide our thinking. In some situations, relying only on probability leads us into contradictions. One way to understand the paradox more deeply is to imagine making real decisions based on these beliefs. Suppose every day you are asked to bet on whether a particular ticket will win. For each individual ticket, the rational choice is to bet on it losing, because you would be right almost every time. But suppose you had to simultaneously make a judgment about the entire system. You would never say the lottery has no winner. Instead, you accept that at least one ticket must win. Yet your individual judgments contradict that acceptance. You end up believing something like, every ticket will lose, but also one ticket will win. This combination cannot logically hold, yet each part seems reasonable when viewed alone. Philosophers see the lottery paradox as a challenge to the idea that rational belief is based only on probability. If each belief is justified by a high probability, but the set of beliefs taken together becomes impossible, then probability alone cannot define rationality. The paradox suggests that a belief must also be consistent with the rest of what we believe. Rational belief is not just about the strength of individual evidence, but about the coherence of the entire set of beliefs. Some respond to the paradox by saying we should not claim that any single ticket will lose, only that each is very unlikely to win. This small shift avoids contradiction, because you are no longer making absolute statements. Instead, you are describing degrees of confidence. However, ordinary reasoning does not always work that way. People naturally convert extremely low probabilities into confident beliefs. We say, "My ticket won't win," because we treat tiny chances as irrelevant. The paradox reminds us that our shortcut can create logical traps. Others argue that beliefs should not be treated like yes or no propositions at all. Instead, we should treat them as graded, with different weights depending on probability. In this framework, you are not required to fully believe that a ticket will lose. You only hold a low confidence belief that reflects statistical likelihood. This avoids the contradiction, but it also changes what we mean by belief. It makes belief more like a sliding scale than an on-off switch. The deeper message of the lottery paradox is about the complexity of reasoning under uncertainty. It shows that many everyday judgments feel intuitive, but when we combine them, they create hidden inconsistencies. The paradox cautions us against treating extremely probable events as certainties. It also encourages us to think more carefully about the structure of our beliefs and how they interact with one another. In the end, the lottery paradox reveals how fragile rationality can seem when probability, logic, and everyday intuition collide. It teaches humility about what we claim to know, especially in situations where outcomes are unpredictable and the numbers are large. And it reminds us that the mind often prefers simple conclusions, even when reality is more complicated. The Sorite's razor paradox is a variation of the classic Sorite's paradox, but with a sharper twist. It explores how we use concepts that rely on vague boundaries, and it questions whether we can ever logically defend those boundaries at all. The paradox begins with a familiar idea. Some concepts, like bald, tall, or rich, do not have precise definitions. There is no exact number of hairs that officially makes someone bald. There is no exact height where a person suddenly becomes tall. These concepts blend gradually, yet we use them every day as if they are clear. The Sorite's razor paradox works by taking this vagueness and slicing into it. It asks us to imagine a series of tiny steps that create a contradiction. For example, suppose we begin with a man who clearly has a full head of hair. Now remove one hair. He is still not bald. Remove another hair. He is still not bald. Remove one hair at a time, always reasoning the same way. Losing a single hair does not seem enough to change someone from not bald into bald. And yet, if we repeat this step enough times, the man eventually becomes bald. Each individual step seems harmless, but the end result contradicts the logic used along the way. The razor portion comes from an added principle. If every borderline case seems indistinguishable from the next, then we should cut away the assumption that the category has a real boundary at all. In other words, if we cannot identify the exact step where the change happens, perhaps the category is fundamentally flawed. The razor tells us to shave off vague concepts altogether. But this creates a new problem. We depend on vague concepts constantly. We need them for communication, decision-making, and everyday life. If we eliminate every vague category, we are left with almost no language to navigate the world. The paradox becomes clearer through another example. Imagine a heap of sand. One grain of sand is not a heap. 2 grains are still not a heap. Adding 1 grain never seems like enough to turn not a heap into a heap. But add grains long enough, and eventually we have a pile anyone would call a heap. The paradox questions where that transition happens, with each tiny addition being too small to matter. Logic seems to say that a heap can never form, but common sense says it definitely does. The Sorite's razor paradox pushes us to confront how poorly logic handles gradual change. When a transformation happens slowly, step by step, we struggle to identify a clear point of transition. Day by day, we age. Breath by breath, we change. No single moment defines when a child becomes an adult, or when a mood becomes sadness, or when sadness becomes depression. And yet we still rely on categories to structure our reality. The paradox exposes the tension between the continuous nature of the world and the discrete categories we impose on it. Philosophers attempt various solutions. Some argue that vague concepts do have boundaries, but they are simply unknown to us. Others suggest that vague terms reflect degrees rather than sharp distinctions. In that view, boldness or tallness works like a dimmer switch, not an on-off switch. Instead of forcing language into strict categories, we allow it to operate in gradients. Another approach is called supervaluationism. It says vague concepts have many equally acceptable ways to draw the boundary. There isn't one correct point where the man becomes bald. Instead, there are multiple possible cutoffs. And as long as we stay within the overlapping range of all reasonable interpretations, our judgments remain valid. This preserves our ability to use vague language without requiring absolute precision. But the so-right's razor paradox pushes further. It challenges whether any vague category can be logically justified. If we cannot identify the exact point of transition, should we trust the category at all? The razor invites us to shave off the concept and examine what remains. However, if we remove every concept with blurry edges, we erase much of human language. Most of life lies in grey areas, not sharp lines. Removing vague terms leaves us unable to describe everyday experiences. This is the heart of the paradox. The world is continuous, but our minds prefer categories. We love clarity, even when reality resists being neatly divided. The Socrates razor paradox shows that vagueness is not a flaw in language. It is a natural reflection of the world's complexity. It also teaches us humility about the limits of logic. Not everything meaningful can be perfectly defined. Some truths live in transitions, gradients, and soft boundaries. And sometimes the world requires concepts that are useful, even if they cannot be made precise. The paradox of the unexpected hanging is one of the strangest and most unsettling puzzles in philosophy, because it combines logic, prediction, surprise, and a twist that seems impossible to resolve. The story begins with a prisoner who is told by a judge that he will be executed sometime next week. The execution will happen on one day between Monday and Friday, but the exact day will be a surprise. He will not know which day it is until the executioner knocks on his cell door. The prisoner thinks carefully, and eventually he becomes convinced that the execution cannot happen at all. His reasoning starts with Friday. He thinks, the execution cannot happen on Friday, because if I am still alive on Thursday evening, then Friday would be the only remaining day. And if Friday is the only possibility, then the execution would no longer be a surprise. I would expect it. Therefore, it cannot happen on Friday. The prisoner feels confident in this logic, so he eliminates Friday as a possible day. Next, he considers Thursday. He reasons, since Friday is impossible, then if I reach Wednesday evening alive, Thursday would be the last remaining day. That means the execution would no longer be a surprise. I would expect it on Thursday, so it cannot happen on Thursday either. With this step, Thursday is eliminated. The prisoner continues. If Thursday and Friday are impossible, then the same logic removes Wednesday, then Tuesday, and finally, Monday. The prisoner concludes that no day in the week is possible. Therefore, the execution cannot happen at all. He relaxes and feels safe. But then, on Wednesday morning, the executioner arrives unexpectedly. The prisoner is completely shocked. The execution does happen, and the surprise is genuine. Yet the prisoner's reasoning seemed airtight. This is the heart of the paradox. The logic proves the event cannot happen, and yet it does happen exactly as described. To understand why this paradox is so powerful, we have to look closely at how the prisoner reasons. Each step in his chain of thought feels correct in isolation. The problem comes from the entire chain taken together. When he eliminates Friday, he is assuming he will have survived until Thursday night. But this assumption may not be valid. In fact, the whole chain of deductions depends on survival assumptions that may never occur. Another way to understand the paradox is to see how the prisoner's expectations shape the situation. He expects the executioner to follow rules of surprise that match his own reasoning, but the judge may not require the surprise to satisfy the prisoner's specific definition. Perhaps the surprise only needs to occur at the moment itself, not logically across the entire week. When the execution happens on Wednesday, the prisoner is shocked precisely because he believed his own argument so strongly. Some philosophers argue that the paradox arises because the prisoner's reasoning is self-defeating. By trying to eliminate all days, he creates a belief system in which every moment feels safe. This false confidence guarantees the surprise. In this view, the paradox shows that knowing too much about future knowledge can be contradictory. Others see the paradox as a clash between two types of reasoning: backward reasoning and forward reasoning. Backward reasoning allows the prisoner to eliminate days, starting from Friday and moving backwards. But forward reasoning, experiencing the week as it unfolds, makes the surprise possible. The two reasoning methods contradict each other, and the paradox emerges from trying to force them into the same logical frame. Modern thinkers also connect the paradox to self-referential statements, similar to the liar paradox. The announcement, "You will be executed next week, and it will be a surprise," is a statement about the prisoner's future knowledge. When the prisoner tries to analyze it logically, he ends up creating a loop where the truth of the announcement depends on the prisoner's reaction to it. The execution can only succeed if the prisoner incorrectly believes it cannot happen. The surprise depends on his false certainty. The paradox also raises questions about prediction and certainty. How much can we know about the future before that knowledge collapses its own conditions? Some events rely on not being predicted. If we try too hard to anticipate them, we break the logic that allows them to occur. In the end, the unexpected hanging paradox teaches us that reasoning about future knowledge is far more complex than reasoning about future events. It shows that our expectations can interfere with the very thing we are analyzing, and it reminds us that some situations cannot be understood through pure deduction. The prisoner's mistake is not in any single logical step, but in believing that perfect prediction about surprise is possible. The paradox remains one of the most fascinating examples of how logic can wrap back on itself, leaving us unsure where certainty ends and mystery begins. The grandfather paradox is one of the most famous puzzles about time travel, identity, and causality. It asks a simple question that leads to a deep contradiction. Imagine that time travel to the past is possible. Now imagine that a person travels back in time and meets their grandfather before the grandfather has any children. For some reason, accidentally or intentionally, the time traveler prevents their grandfather from having a child. Maybe they interfere with a key moment. Maybe an accident occurs. Or maybe, in the classic version, the time traveler kills their grandfather. If the grandfather never has a child, then the time traveler's parent is never born. And if the parent is never born, then the time traveler cannot be born either. But if the time traveler does not exist, then they cannot go back in time. And if they cannot go back in time, then they cannot interfere with the grandfather in the first place. The paradox creates a loop that destroys its own cause. At first, the paradox seems like a simple logical puzzle, but the more we examine it, the stranger it becomes. It challenges the very structure of cause and effect. In everyday life, we understand events in a clear order. One thing happens first, and it leads to something next. But in the grandfather paradox, the cause cancels the conditions that make the effect possible. The time traveler's action unravels the chain of events that originally created them. This is why the paradox is often used as an argument against the possibility of time travel to the past. Some philosophers and physicists argue that the paradox proves that backward time travel cannot happen at all. They say that the laws of the universe must protect themselves from contradictions. If an action in the past could erase the future, then reality would collapse. Therefore, the universe must forbid such actions.
According to this view, the paradox shows that time is not flexible in the way we imagine. You can travel through time in theory, but you cannot change events that already exist. Another approach suggests that the paradox reveals something deeper about time. Instead of seeing time as a straight line with a single history, some thinkers propose that time may branch into different paths. This leads to the idea of parallel universes or alternate timelines. In this interpretation, when the time traveler goes back and changes the past, they do not rewrite their own timeline. Instead, they create or enter a new one. The original timeline, the one in which they were born, remains intact. The altered timeline forms a different world where the grandfather never has children. In this world, the time traveler is an outsider, someone who came from another branch of reality. This solution avoids contradiction by separating the cause and effect into different universes. The grandfather paradox also raises questions about free will. If time is fixed, then the time traveler may be physically unable to harm their grandfather. Something might always intervene, a distraction, a failed attempt, a coincidence. This idea is called the self-consistency principle. It states that any actions taken by a time traveler must be consistent with the traveler's own history. You cannot undo the events that lead to your existence. You can participate in the past, but only in ways that do not break the timeline. This turns the paradox into a statement about destiny. Your freedom to act in the past is limited by the future you already came from. Another interesting response suggests that the paradox depends on a misunderstanding of identity. The time traveler's non-existence does not necessarily forbid their presence in the past. Maybe identity in time is more flexible than we assume. Perhaps the time traveler is not erased instantly because they belong to a different temporal frame. These ideas push us beyond traditional logic and into deeper philosophical territory. Still, the paradox continues to fascinate because it exposes how our minds struggle with circular causality. We are used to events flowing forward. We struggle with loops in which the effect becomes the cause of its own disappearance. The grandfather paradox forces us to face the limits of human intuition. It also shows that time, despite feeling familiar, might be structured in ways we do not fully understand. Whether we see it as a warning against backward time travel, a clue toward multiple timelines, or an invitation to rethink causality, the paradox remains powerful. It teaches us that simple questions can reveal enormous mysteries. It reminds us that what seems logically impossible may still be physically interesting. And it encourages us to explore the boundaries between imagination, physics, and philosophy. In the end, the grandfather paradox is more than a thought experiment. It is a doorway into understanding how fragile our concepts of time and identity truly are, and it continues to inspire scientists, storytellers, and philosophers who search for ways to make sense of the idea that the past could be changed, or that it might be forever unchangeable. The crocodile paradox is an ancient logical puzzle that looks simple, almost playful, but quickly turns into a deep problem about prediction, self-reference, and the strange loops that happen when statements refer to themselves. The story begins with a crocodile who steals a child from a parent. The parent begs the crocodile to return the child. The crocodile, being a creature of twisted logic, makes an unusual deal. He says he will return the child only if the parent can correctly predict whether or not he will return the child. If the parent gives the correct prediction, the child will be returned. If the prediction is wrong, the crocodile keeps the child. At first, the problem seems straightforward. The parent must simply predict what the crocodile will do. But the paradox appears when the parent gives a specific answer. "You will not return my child." Now the crocodile must determine what to do next. If the crocodile decides to return the child, then the parent's prediction becomes correct. But if the prediction is correct, the crocodile must return the child, because that is the rule of the agreement. This seems fine on the surface. However, if the crocodile returns the child,
it would make the parent's prediction correct, which forces him to return the child. That part seems consistent. But what if the crocodile decides not to return the child? If he keeps the child, the parent's prediction, "You will not return the child," is also correct. And if the prediction is correct, the crocodile is obligated by his own rule to return the child. But returning the child would make the prediction wrong. And if the prediction is wrong, he would be allowed to keep the child. Yet keeping the child would make the prediction right again. Every possible decision leads back into the loop. There is no stable outcome. This creates the paradox. The crocodile has trapped himself in a situation where he cannot satisfy his own rule. Any action he takes results in a contradiction. The parent's prediction creates a self-referential statement that breaks the crocodile's logic. The crocodile cannot return the child without violating the rule, and he cannot refuse to return the child without violating the same rule. No matter what he does, he both must and must not act in a particular way. The paradox works because the parent's prediction refers directly to the crocodile's decision. Instead of predicting a normal event, the parent predicts the outcome of the rule itself. This traps the crocodile in a loop where the truth of the prediction depends on the crocodile's action, while the crocodile's action depends on the truth of the prediction. It is a circular dependency, like a mirror reflecting itself endlessly. This structure resembles other famous self-referential paradoxes, such as the liar paradox. This statement is false. If the statement is true, then it is false, which means it is not true, which means it is true again. The crocodile paradox uses the same kind of loop, but in the form of an action-bound promise rather than a sentence. The rule that the crocodile must return the child if the prediction is correct becomes impossible to follow when the prediction refers to the rule itself. The deeper message behind the paradox concerns the limitations of logical systems that attempt to regulate themselves. When rules refer to outcomes that depend on the rules themselves, contradictions arise. The crocodile's promise includes a clause that cannot be fulfilled under certain predictions. The scenario exposes the fragility of systems that attempt to guarantee fairness or consistency through absolute rules. All it takes is one clever statement to destabilize the entire structure. The paradox also raises questions about responsibility and intention. The crocodile claims to follow logic, but logic alone is not enough to resolve situations where rules are self-referential. Human reasoning often avoids such contradictions intuitively. We understand that some rules break when confronted with self-referential predictions. In contrast, the crocodile behaves like a machine trapped in a logical loop. The paradox highlights how strict rules without flexibility can collapse under pressure. Some philosophers interpret the crocodile paradox as a demonstration that not every question deserves a meaningful answer. The scenario itself may be structurally incoherent. The crocodile's promise creates a condition that cannot logically function. Therefore, the paradox may reflect the idea that certain rule-based systems cannot handle self-reference, no matter how carefully they are constructed. Another interpretation connects the paradox to prediction and free will. If someone can predict your action perfectly, they can manipulate the situation to trap you logically. The crocodile becomes powerless because the parent's prediction leaves him no room to act without violating his rule. Ultimately, the crocodile paradox remains a playful but profound lesson in logic. It shows that rules must be built with awareness of self-reference. It teaches that not all promises can be kept, and it reminds us once again that paradoxes often arise in the spaces where logic meets language, where rules meet interpretation, and where predictions loop back onto the events they attempt to describe. Gödel's incompleteness theorem is one of the most important discoveries in the history of logic, mathematics, and the philosophy of knowledge. It challenges a belief that many people once thought was obvious: the belief that mathematics could be built upon a perfect, complete, and consistent foundation. Before Gödel, many thinkers hoped that all mathematical truths could eventually be proven using a single unified system of rules. They imagined mathematics as a giant machine: input the right symbols, follow the right steps, and every truth would be reachable and provable. Gödel showed that this dream is impossible. His theorem reveals that any system capable of doing real mathematics will contain truths that cannot be proven within that system. No matter how hard we try to build a perfect structure, something always escapes the rules. The theorem begins with the idea of a formal system. This is a set of axioms, basic rules or statements we accept as true, and the logical steps that allow us to derive new statements from them. For example, arithmetic is built on simple axioms. Numbers exist, addition works a certain way, multiplication works a certain way, and so on. These rules allow us to prove thousands of mathematical facts. Early mathematicians hoped that if the axioms were chosen wisely, the system could be complete, meaning every true statement could be proven. They also hoped the system could be consistent, meaning no contradictions could ever appear. Gödel discovered that this hope was impossible. He created a clever method to let mathematics talk about itself. He encoded mathematical statements as numbers, using a process now called Gödel numbering. This allowed him to construct a special sentence inside the system, a sentence that refers to its own provability. The sentence essentially said, "This statement cannot be proven." It is similar in spirit to the liar paradox, which says, "This sentence is false." But Gödel's version was carefully structured so that it fit perfectly within mathematics without breaking its rules. The magical twist comes next. If the system is consistent, then this special statement cannot be proven, because if it were proven, it would be false, and the system would contain a contradiction. Therefore, the statement is true. It accurately says, "This statement cannot be proven," but the system cannot prove it. A true statement exists outside the reach of the system's rules. This is the first incompleteness theorem. Every consistent formal system that can express basic arithmetic contains true statements that cannot be proven within that system. Then comes the second theorem, which is even more shocking. Gödel showed that such a system cannot prove its own consistency. If the system could prove it was consistent, it would actually contradict itself. This means no mathematical system can fully guarantee its own reliability, using only its own internal rules. It must rely on something outside itself for that assurance. These discoveries changed mathematics forever. Gödel showed that mathematics is not a closed box. It cannot be sealed into one perfect set of rules. There will always be truths that stand beyond the system's ability to capture them. This does not make mathematics unreliable. Instead, it reveals that mathematics is richer and more mysterious than anyone expected. Logical systems have boundaries, and no system can escape them completely. Philosophically, Gödel's theorem touches on deep ideas about knowledge and certainty. It suggests that full completeness is impossible. Any system capable of expressing complex truths must contain statements that lie forever beyond proof. This challenges the dream of ultimate certainty. It also highlights the creativity and intuition of human mathematicians. Humans can often see that a Gödel statement is true, even though the system cannot prove it. This raises questions about whether the human mind is more flexible than formal logic, or whether our reasoning uses principles that cannot be captured by strict rules. The theorem also affects computer science. It implies that no algorithm can decide every mathematical truth. This relates to the limits of computation, artificial intelligence, and even the idea of whether machines can fully replicate human reasoning. Gödel's work shows that certain types of questions will always be undecidable within a given system, despite its complexity, Gödel's incompleteness. Theorem carries a surprisingly poetic message. It tells us that truth is always larger than the rules we use to describe it. It reminds us that logic has edges, and beyond those edges lies a space that cannot be fully pinned down. It teaches humility, showing that even the most rigorous structures have limits. And it reminds us that mystery is not a flaw in mathematics, it is part of its beauty. The sleeping judge paradox is a fascinating puzzle about responsibility, decision-making, and whether a legal outcome remains valid when the person meant to make the decision is unaware of what is happening. The paradox seems simple at first. A judge is sitting in court during a trial. At some point, without anyone noticing, the judge falls asleep. While the judge is asleep, the attorneys present arguments, witnesses testify, and evidence is discussed. Eventually, the judge wakes up just in time to announce a verdict. The question is, can the verdict still be considered valid? And if the judge was asleep for key parts of the trial, who, if anyone, actually made the decision? The paradox begins with the idea that a judge's role is to listen, deliberate, and reach a reasoned judgment based on the evidence presented. If the judge misses parts of the argument, the decision should logically be compromised. A person cannot judge fairly without hearing the facts. But the paradox becomes more complex when we consider how little the outside world can observe about what is happening inside the judge's mind. What if the judge's verdict matches exactly what it should have been, even without hearing everything? Is the verdict invalid simply because of how it was reached? Suppose the judge wakes, hears the final portion of the case, and within seconds announces the correct and legally appropriate verdict. The verdict aligns perfectly with the law and with the evidence the judge did hear. From the outside, the decision appears proper. But internally, the judge's reasoning process is flawed because it is based on incomplete information. This creates tension between the appearance of justice and the process of justice. The paradox becomes sharper when we introduce a second layer of uncertainty. The judge may not even know they were asleep. Micro-sleep episodes happen in real life. A person may believe they were awake the whole time, while actually missing minutes of important information. If the judge thinks they heard everything, they will act as though the verdict is fully informed, but their confidence does not change the fact that their knowledge is incomplete. If they are unaware of the gap, their decision feels legitimate to them, even though it may not be legitimate in reality. What makes the sleeping judge paradox truly puzzling is the idea that justice is normally evaluated by outcomes. If a verdict is correct, fair, and consistent with the law, should the internal process matter? Some philosophers say yes, because fairness requires not only a fair result, but a fair procedure. A verdict is not valid simply because it happens to be correct. It must be produced by the proper mechanisms. A sleeping judge violates that mechanism. Others argue the opposite. If the verdict is correct, then the actions or inattentiveness of the judge become irrelevant. We do not invalidate a correct conclusion just because it was reached imperfectly. After all, people reach correct conclusions with incomplete information all the time. A correct verdict might still serve justice, even if it was reached accidentally. The paradox becomes even more tangled if we imagine that the judge's unconscious mind was processing information. Some research suggests that even while sleeping or dozing, the brain may absorb fragments of sound. So perhaps the judge actually heard more than we think. This introduces uncertainty about what counts as hearing the case. Is full conscious awareness required, or is partial awareness enough? The boundaries become blurry. Another perspective suggests that perhaps the judge is not the true decision maker in the paradox at all. If the judge's verdict accidentally aligns with what an impartial observer would decide, then the verdict's authority may come from the system as a whole, not from the judge's personal reasoning. In this view, the judge is simply a vehicle for delivering the decision,
and the justice system itself, is the source of legitimacy. But this interpretation feels unsatisfying, because it reduces the judge's role to something mechanical. Now consider an extreme twist. Suppose the judge slept through the entire trial, but woke up at the right moment and guessed the verdict. If the guess happened to be correct, would anyone know? And if no one knows, is the verdict still valid? This challenges the idea that legitimacy rests on what actually happened, rather than what can be proven to have happened. In the end, the sleeping judge paradox exposes the fragile boundary between appearance and reality. A verdict can be correct, but invalid. It can be valid, but reached by flawed reasoning. It can appear legitimate, even when the process was broken. The paradox reveals how deeply our systems depend on trust. Trust in the judge's awareness, trust in the process, and trust in the unseen reasoning that produces decisions. It also shows that responsibility is not only about outcomes, it is also about the integrity of the decision-making path. The paradox teaches that justice is not just a result, it is a process. And when that process collapses, even silently, even invisibly, the meaning of justice becomes uncertain. The paradox of knowability begins with a simple and appealing idea. Every truth, no matter how hidden or obscure, could in principle be known. Even if no one currently knows a particular fact, it seems reasonable to say that the fact could be discovered. This idea feels optimistic. It suggests the world is open to understanding. It suggests that truth is never permanently unreachable. But when we combine this idea with a small amount of logical reasoning, something strange happens. We reach a conclusion that every truth must actually be known by someone. That sounds impossible, and it creates a paradox. The paradox begins with a claim proposed by philosophers called the knowability principle. If something is true, then it is possible for it to be known. This principle is modest. It does not claim that all truths are known. It only claims that all truths could be known. There might be secrets hidden underground, facts about distant planets, or mathematical truths no one has discovered yet. The principle simply says they are discoverable, but here is where the paradox begins. Consider a statement that is true but unknown. For example, imagine a specific historical detail that nobody has ever uncovered, like the exact number of grains of sand on a beach at a certain moment in the past. Let's call this fact T. According to the knowability principle, even though T is unknown, it could be known. Now imagine a new statement. T is true and T is unknown. This combined statement is also true, because we are assuming T really is an unknown truth. So according to the knowability principle, this new statement should also be knowable. But here comes the twist. If someone were to learn that T is true and T is unknown, then the statement would instantly become false. It would no longer be unknown. The moment it becomes known, it stops being true that it is unknown. The act of knowing it destroys the content of the truth. This means that the statement T is true and T is unknown cannot ever be known. But if it cannot be known, then the knowability principle is violated. And if it can be known, it becomes false. Either way, the principle collapses into contradiction. Philosophers who first explored this paradox argued that the only way to avoid contradiction is to accept that no truth can remain permanently unknown. If every truth is knowable, and if knowing an unknown truth makes it impossible for it to be unknown, then the only consistent conclusion is that there are no unknown truths. In other words, every truth must already be known, but that is clearly false. Nobody knows every fact about the universe. Nobody knows the thoughts of every person, the future of every event, or every hidden detail of nature. Yet, the logic seems to force this absurd result. This is the heart of the paradox of knowability.
A principle that sounds humble and hopeful ends up suggesting something extreme and impossible. Why does this happen? One explanation is that the paradox emerges because truth and knowledge behave differently. Truth does not change when someone observes it, but knowledge does. When we convert truth into knowledge, we alter its status. When truth refers to its own unknowability, the act of knowing disrupts the truth structure. This is similar to self-referential paradoxes, like the liar paradox, where a statement collapses under the weight of its own meaning. Another explanation is that the knowability principle was too broad. Perhaps we should not apply it to statements that include phrases like, "and this is unknown." Maybe only some truths are knowable, and others are beyond the reach of discovery, not because they are mystical, but because the structure of the statement prevents them from being known in a consistent way. Some philosophers suggest that the paradox does not prove that all truths are known, but only that the knowability principle must be interpreted more carefully. Maybe we should say that every truth that does not involve self-referential knowledge conditions could be known. This avoids the paradox, but it weakens the original optimism. Not everything is potentially knowable. Some truths are structurally sealed off from knowledge. Others argue that knowledge should be graded rather than absolute. Instead of saying something is known or unknown, we could talk about degrees of justification or probability. This would soften the paradox, but also change what we mean by knowledge. What makes the paradox of knowability so powerful is that it reveals a tension between truth and discovery. It shows that not all truths behave the same when we approach them with the idea of knowability. It teaches us that some truths cannot be revealed without altering their nature. And it reminds us that even a gentle-sounding philosophical principle can unravel into a surprising and complicated problem. The Monty Hall paradox is one of the most famous and counterintuitive puzzles in probability. It is based on a real television game show from the 1970s, where contestants had to choose between 3 doors. Behind one door was a valuable prize, often a car. Behind the other 2 doors were goats. The contestant would choose a door, hoping to pick the car. But before revealing what was behind the chosen door, the host, Monty Hall, would open one of the 2 remaining doors, always revealing a goat. Then he would ask the contestant a simple question. Do you want to stay with your original choice, or switch to the other unopened door? At first, the problem seems straightforward. 2 doors remain. One has a car, one has a goat. So it feels like a 50-50 chance. Many people logically conclude that switching does not matter. But the paradox arises when we realize that switching actually doubles the chance of winning. The correct strategy is always to switch. This conclusion feels deeply unreasonable, and many people resist it. Even mathematicians originally argued fiercely about it. But once the logic becomes clear, the result is undeniable. To understand the paradox, start with the contestant's first choice. When the game begins, the contestant picks one of 3 doors. There is a 1/3 chance that the chosen door has the car, and a 2/3 chance that the car is behind one of the other 2 doors. This part is simple. Now Monty, who knows where the car is, must open one of the remaining doors. Importantly, he always reveals a goat. He never opens a door with the car behind it. This action, Monty's reveal, is the key to the entire paradox. Because Monty always shows a goat, he gives the contestant new information. But that information is not evenly spread across the 2 remaining doors. The door the contestant originally picked still has only a 1/3 chance of being correct. But instead of the 2/3 chance being split between 2 unknown doors, Monty has collapsed the entire 2/3 probability into the single unopened door. In other words, Monty's reveal does not make the probabilities equal. it shifts all the leftover probability onto the remaining closed door. An easy way to see this is to imagine the contestant making a bad first guess. Since the contestant's first pick is wrong 2 out of 3 times, Monty's reveal helps eliminate only goats in those cases. Therefore, switching wins in all scenarios where the contestant initially guessed incorrectly, and that is most of the time. So switching wins 2/3 of the time, while staying wins only 1/3 of the time. Another way to understand the paradox is to expand the number of doors. Suppose the game had 100 doors instead of 3. The contestant picks one. There is now a 1% chance that their chosen door has the prize, and a 99% chance that the prize is behind one of the other 99 doors. Monty, knowing where the prize is, then opens 98 empty doors on the losing side, leaving only one other closed door. Would you stay with your one door that had only a 1% chance, or switch to the single remaining door, holding the entire 99% probability? In the large number version, the logic becomes obvious, but the same logic applies to the 3-door version. The smaller scale just hides the effect more subtly. The Monty Hall paradox challenges our intuition about probability because we naturally treat the final 2 doors as equal. Our minds tend to ignore the fact that Monty's intervention is not random. He is not simply picking a door to open. His choice is constrained by the rule that he cannot reveal the prize. This special knowledge affects the distribution of probabilities. The paradox reminds us that information changes outcomes, even when the change feels invisible. What makes the Monty Hall paradox so important is not only its surprising solution, but also what it teaches about decision-making. Many real-world problems involve hidden information and actions influenced by someone else's knowledge. Doctors interpreting medical tests, investors reacting to market signals, and scientists analyzing experimental data all face situations where information is filtered or revealed through a process that depends on hidden factors. The paradox shows that our intuition for probability is often unreliable, especially when additional information enters the situation indirectly. The paradox also teaches humility. Even experienced mathematicians resisted the correct answer when it was first published in a popular magazine. People argued emotionally that switching could not possibly improve the odds. But careful reasoning, simulation, and mathematical proof all confirmed the correct result. It shows that sometimes our most confident beliefs deserve to be questioned, and sometimes the world behaves in ways that defy our expectations until we examine the structure carefully. In the end, the Monty Hall paradox is not just a puzzle about goats and doors. It is a lesson about logic, uncertainty, and the ways our intuition can betray us. It encourages us to be curious, to analyze situations deeply, and to remember that probability often hides truths that are far from obvious. And it reminds us that switching, both in games and in life, can sometimes open the door to unexpected success.
The zookeeper paradox is a thought experiment about responsibility, prediction, and indirect control. It explores what happens when someone tries to follow a rule perfectly in a situation where their actions are influenced by the behavior of others, especially unpredictable behavior. The paradox is framed around a zookeeper, whose job is to keep the animals fed and safe. The rule is simple. The zookeeper must feed every animal that is hungry, but one special animal, a clever monkey, creates a situation in which the zookeeper cannot follow the rule without breaking it at the same time. Imagine a zoo where the animals behave normally, except for one mischievous monkey who loves to test the limits of the zookeeper's responsibility. The monkey has learned the rule. It understands that the zookeeper must feed any hungry animal. The monkey finds a way to exploit this rule by refusing food until exactly the moment when feeding it would create a contradiction. For instance, suppose the zookeeper must also follow another rule. No feeding is allowed after closing time. The monkey waits until the last second before closing, then announces its hunger. If the zookeeper feeds the monkey, he violates the rule about feeding after hours. If he refuses to feed it, he violates the rule about feeding every hungry animal. Either choice leads to breaking a rule. This is the basic shape of the paradox. Two rules that seem perfectly reasonable on their own become impossible to satisfy. When combined with the behavior of an unpredictable agent who knows how the rules work, the zookeeper is trapped. A system designed to maintain order collapses under pressure from an intelligent participant who can manipulate the timing and structure of the rules. The paradox becomes deeper when we imagine the monkey escalating its strategy. Instead of waiting for the last second, it waits until the zookeeper has just finished feeding all the other animals and has locked the pantry. The moment the locks click, the monkey declares hunger. The zookeeper knows that unlocking the pantry after hours is forbidden, yet ignoring a hungry animal is also forbidden. The paradox grows sharper. The rules assume normal conditions, but the monkey acts strategically to create abnormal ones. Some versions push the scenario even further. Suppose the zookeeper develops a new rule to avoid the problem. He decides to check on the monkey earlier, to prevent last-minute hunger declarations. But the monkey anticipates this. It boldly refuses to show hunger during the early rounds, only revealing it at the precise moment when feeding becomes impossible. The zookeeper adds more rules, trying to defend against manipulation, but each new rule simply gives the monkey new opportunities. The more rules the system has, the easier it becomes to trap the zookeeper in contradictions. The paradox illustrates a powerful idea. A rule-following system can be broken when one participant understands the rules too well. Systems assume cooperation, or at least neutrality. But a participant who actively exploits the system can reveal weaknesses that otherwise remain invisible. This leads to a broader philosophical point. Many systems in life, legal, political, educational, are built on rules that seem reasonable in isolation. But when people intentionally exploit loopholes, the system begins to produce contradictions, impossible responsibilities, or tasks that cannot be fulfilled. The zookeeper paradox shows that the more rigid the rules, the more vulnerable the system becomes to clever disruption. There is also a second layer to the paradox: the issue of prediction. The zookeeper tries to predict when the monkey will become hungry. But the monkey's behavior depends on the zookeeper's prediction. If the zookeeper tries to act early, the monkey waits. If the zookeeper waits, the monkey acts. This creates a feedback loop in which prediction influences behavior, and behavior influences prediction. It is similar to paradoxes about self-reference, where statements refer to themselves in a way that breaks logical structure. Another interpretation focuses on responsibility. If the zookeeper cannot fulfill both rules at once, is he truly responsible for breaking them? The paradox suggests that responsibility sometimes collapses when the system itself is contradictory. Breaking a rule is inevitable, not because of failure, but because the rules create an impossible situation. This is similar to classic double binds in psychology, where a person receives conflicting instructions and cannot obey both. The zookeeper paradox teaches that no system of rules can remain perfect if its participants can manipulate timing, expectations, or the boundaries of responsibility. It shows how rigid principles fail in dynamic environments. and it reminds us that predicting behavior becomes impossible when the behavior itself adapts to the prediction. The Condorcet paradox, also known as the paradox of voting, reveals something unsettling about group decision-making. It shows that even when every individual in a group has clear, rational preferences, the group as a whole can end up with preferences that are irrational, inconsistent, or even circular. In other words, a group of perfectly reasonable people can create a collective decision that makes no logical sense. This paradox challenges the idea that majority rule naturally leads to fair or stable outcome. It suggests that democratic decisions can break down simply because of how preferences combine. The paradox begins with a simple scenario. Imagine 3 voters, A, B, and C, and 3 choices, X, Y, and Z. Each voter has a perfectly reasonable ranking of these options. For example, voter A prefers X over Y and Y over Z. Voter B prefers Y over Z and Z over X. Voter C prefers Z over X and X over Y. Individually, each voter's ranking is completely rational, but when we compare the preferences pair by pair using majority voting, something strange happens. If we ask the group whether they prefer X or Y, voter A and voter C prefer X, so X. Now compare Y and Z. Voter A and voter B prefer Y, so Y wins. Finally, compare X and Z. Voter B and voter C prefer Z, so Z win. But here is the problem. The group prefers X over Y, Y over Z, and Z over X. This creates a loop. It is impossible. The group's preference is not linear. It is circular. This circular pattern is the core of the Condorcet paradox. Even though each person is rational, the majority's the group wants X more than Y, Y more than Z, and yet Z more than X. No single option satisfies the majority in all comparison. There is no true winner. The paradox shows that majority voting can produce results that contradict them. This is not a rare or theoretical occurrence. It can happen anytime preferences differ significantly across voters. The paradox becomes even more troubling when we realize it can appear in real political elections, committee decisions, or organizational. Whenever 3 or more options exist and preferences vary, the group can fall into a cycle. If the result depends on the order in which votes occur, a skilled organizer can manipulate the sequence to produce almost any outcome. This means that the democratic process, something we consider fair and stable, can be vulnerable to strategic control. It also means there may be no single best to the majority. Instead, each choice beats another choice, which beats the first choice. The group has no stable preference. This contradicts the idea that voting automatically reveals the will of the people. The will of the people may not exist as a single, coherent thing. The paradox leads to deeper philosophical questions about collective rationality. Can groups be rational in the same way individuals are? If not, how should we design systems that avoid irrational outcomes? Many voting systems attempt to solve or reduce this problem, but each solution introduces its own trade-offs. For example, some systems eliminate the least popular option in rounds. Some systems rank choices. Some systems assign points instead of using head-to-head votes. But none of these systems is perfect. Each one can produce its own kind of paradox or unfair outcome. This leads to another important. The paradox does not come from irrational. It comes from the structure of how individual preferences combine. When preferences vary widely and overlap in complex ways, no voting system can perfectly without this idea begins in another theory called arrows, which proves that no fair voting can satisfy desirable. The Condorcet paradox was one of the first explaining why. Another layer of the paradox concerns stability. Suppose a council or committee tries to choose a policy using majority rule. Because of the preference loop, the group could be stuck endlessly switching. If they vote on X versus Y, they choose X. If they vote on X versus Z, choose Z. If they vote on Z versus, the outcome depends on the agenda. Whoever controls the result, even if they have no majority power. The paradox teaches us something uncomfortable. Majority rule works well for simple decisions, but can break down in complex ones. It reminds us that fairness is not as straightforward as counting votes. It shows that democracy is a compromise between imperfect systems, and it warns us that the wisdom of the majority can sometimes behave unpredictably. In the end, the Condorcet paradox is more than a mathematical curiosity. It is a reminder that human choices, when combined, can behave differently than individual choices. It encourages us to think carefully about how decisions are made, how options are structured, and how rules influence outcomes. It invites humility, because even with rational individuals, collective rationality is not guaranteed. And it reveals the delicate balance required whenever groups try to choose together.
The paradox of tragedy is one of the oldest and most intriguing puzzles in aesthetics and human psychology. It asks a deceptively simple question: why do we seek out experiences that make us feel sadness, fear, grief, or despair? Why do we willingly watch tragic movies, read heartbreaking novels, or listen to sorrowful music, even though these emotions are ones we often try to avoid in real life? The paradox challenges the idea that people naturally desire pleasure and avoid pain. Yet, in art, we seem drawn toward emotional suffering. The puzzle becomes even deeper when we notice that people often describe tragic experiences as uplifting, cathartic, or even beautiful. The paradox begins with a basic assumption: humans pursue happiness and avoid distress. If this is true, then voluntarily exposing ourselves to grief should be irrational. And yet, tragedy continues to captivate. Ancient Greek plays like Oedipus Rex, Shakespearean tragedies, modern films about loss, and novels filled with heartbreak attract millions of people. The paradox forces us to ask, how can something painful be pleasurable? One explanation comes from Aristotle, who argued that tragedy produces catharsis, a cleansing or release of emotion. According to this view, tragedy allows us to confront fear, sadness, or pity in a safe environment. The emotions become purified, transformed, or balanced inside us. We feel sorrow for the characters, but through that sorrow we also gain emotional clarity and a sense of renewal. Aristotle believed that tragedy does not harm the viewer. Instead, it guides them to a deeper emotional equilibrium. Another explanation suggests that tragedy provides meaning. When we watch suffering in art, it is not meaningless suffering. It is structured, understandable, and tied to themes like love, sacrifice, destiny, or justice. In real life, suffering often feels chaotic or senseless, but in art, suffering becomes part of a coherent story. We find purpose in the pain because it fits a larger arc. The tragedy may be sad, but it reveals truths about human behavior, fragility, loyalty, or moral choices. In this sense, tragedy enriches us emotionally and intellectually. A different perspective focuses. Tragedy invites us into the minds and hearts. It expands our. When we witness a character's loss or heartbreak, we recognize parts of us. This shared experience deepens our understanding. The emotional pain we feel is real, but it connects us to others instead of isolating. The sadness becomes meaningful because it reinforces our sense of. There is also contra. Pleasure often feels more intense when it is paired with sadness. A tragic story may ultimately highlight beauty, resilience, hope, or connection. The sadness enhances the value of these qualities. By contrast, we feel uplifted not because the tragedy is pleasant, but because it reveals depths of emotion that ordinary happiness cannot reach. The experience becomes enriching rather than depressing. Another layer of the paradox comes from curiosity. Tragedies explore extreme situations, loss of love, betrayal, moral dilemmas, or unavoidable fates. These scenarios engage our minds. They allow us to study human behavior under pressure. We want to understand how people respond when everything. Tragedy becomes a form of emotional learning, giving us insight into life without requiring us to suffer the same experiences. There is also an argument that tragedy provides a sense of control. By choosing to engage with sad stories, we control the timing, the intensity, and the context of the emotion. Real life does not offer. Tragedy in art becomes a safe container for powerful feelings. We can step into sorrow and step out again when the story ends. In this way, tragedy becomes a rehearsal for real or challenging. It strengthens or resilient. Some philosophers point out that tragedy allows a kind of double experience. We feel sorrow for the characters, but we also feel pleasure in recognizing the artistry. We mourn the fictional loss while appreciating the skill of the storyteller, the beauty of the language, or the elegance of the narrative. The pain exists within a frame of aesthetic appreciation, and that frame transforms the suffering into something that can be valued. The paradox of tragedy ultimately reveals something profound. We are not creatures who seek pleasure only in simple or straightforward. We seek understanding, connection, depth, and meaning. Tragedy often gives us more powerfully. It touches the deepest parts of it. Reminds us that sadness is not always something. Sometimes it is something that teaches, heals. The paradox of suspense asks a question that seems impossible at first. How can we feel genuine suspense, fear, or tension in a story when we already know exactly how it will end? People rewatch movies they love. They reread books with familiar twists. They enjoy stories where the ending is not merely predictable, it is completely known. And yet, they still sit on the edge of their seats. Their heart still races, their breath still tightens, they still feel suspense. This seems contradictory. Suspense is supposed to depend on uncertainty. If you already know the outcome, how can you feel suspense at all? Imagine watching a thriller for the second time. You already know the hero survives. You know when the danger will appear. You know the jump scare will happen in 5 seconds. You know the villain's plan. But your body responds just as intensely as before. Your chest tightens as the footsteps grow louder. Your pulse quickens as the music builds. Even though your mind knows the ending, your emotions behave as if you are seeing everything for the first time. This is the core of the paradox of suspense. We experience suspense in situations where suspense should logically be impossible. One explanation argues that suspense does not come only from uncertainty about the outcome. Instead, it comes from the emotional structure of the moment, the anticipation, the pacing, the danger, the character's vulnerability. Suspense operates like a psychological reflex. Even if you know what happens, your emotional system reacts to the cues in the story. The tension in the music, the expressions on the characters' faces, the mood of the scene, these things trigger instinctive responses. Suspense, in this view, is less about what you know and more about what you feel. Another explanation suggests that our knowledge of the outcome and our emotional experience operate on different levels. Intellectually, you may know the hero lives, but emotionally, you re-enter the story world as though the outcome were uncertain. You voluntarily suspend your knowledge, immersing yourself in the unfolding drama. You allow yourself to react as if the danger is fresh. This is similar to how we cry during a sad movie, even when we know it is fictional. Our emotional system engages with the moment, not with the long-term memory of the ending. Some philosophers argue that suspense emerges from caring, not uncertainty. When we care about a character, we feel tension, not because we doubt the ending, but because we empathize with the character's experience. If a character is terrified, we feel tension even if we already know they will survive. The suspense comes from the character's perspective, not our own. We feel what they feel. Their fear becomes our fear. Their vulnerability creates emotional pressure inside us. In this view, suspense is about connection rather than surprise. There is also the idea of future-directed emotions. Even when we know the ending, our brains respond to events as they happen in time. We still anticipate the danger because anticipation is built into our psychological wiring. When the scene slows down, when the music changes, when the lighting shifts, our mind prepares for impact. This preparation creates tension. Knowledge does not fully override emotional anticipation. The body reacts to immediate cues, not to distant memories. Another perspective highlights the concept of dramatic irony. When the audience knows something the characters do not, suspense can increase rather than decrease. For example, if you know a danger is coming but the character doesn't, you feel even more tension. You want to warn them. You see them walking into a trap. Suspense builds from the difference between your knowledge and the character's ignorance. This form of suspense does not require uncertainty about the ending, only concern for the character's experience. Some theories propose that rewatching a tragic or suspenseful scene taps into something deeper, the desire to relive emotional peaks. Suspense is one of the most intense emotional states. Even if you know what will happen, the journey still triggers pleasure through anticipation, empathy, and emotional energy. Just as people re-listen to their favorite songs for the emotional wave, they re-watch suspenseful scenes for the physiological. Another explanation says that suspense is partly about hoping and fearing, not only predicting. You may know how the story ends, but you still hope for the character's safety. You still fear the upcoming danger. Humans are capable of holding on to hopes and fears, even when they know the logical outcome. Emotions do not always obey reasoning. The paradox of suspense teaches us something essential about the human mind. Our emotional experience is not controlled entirely by knowledge. We can know an outcome and still feel fear, tension, worry, or hope. We respond to cues, connection, character empathy, and narrative rhythm. Suspense, far from being just about uncertainty, is about engagement. It is about caring deeply enough to feel tension, even when nothing is at stake for us personally. The paradox reminds us that emotions and logic often follow different rules. and that this difference is part of what makes storytelling so powerful. The paradox of hedonism explores a surprising idea. The more directly and aggressively we pursue pleasure, the less likely we are to actually obtain it. It seems contradictory. If pleasure is what we want, then seeking it should bring us closer to it. But experience often reveals the opposite. When we chase pleasure for its own sake, when we make it our ultimate goal, it begins to slip out of. Happiness becomes fragile, joy becomes forced, satisfaction becomes shallow or temporary. This strange relationship between pleasure and pursuit is the core of the paradox. The paradox begins with the assumption that people desire happiness. Nearly everyone agrees that happiness is a good thing, and many people naturally seek activities that promise joy, excitement, comfort, or satisfaction. The trouble begins when pleasure becomes an obsession, or the primary motivation behind everything. Instead of enjoying experiences for their own richness, the hedonistic mindset uses experiences only as tools. The experience becomes secondary. Pleasure becomes. Imagine someone who goes to wanting desperately to have fun. They constantly check for enjoying them. They compare their mood. They try to push the feeling of, but the more self-conscious, the harder it is to actually. Their focus on pleasure are too busy measuring happiness to experience. This self-defeating loop appears in many areas of life. Someone who tries too hard to relax often becomes more tense. Someone who tries obsessively to sleep often becomes more. Someone who tries forcefully to impress others often seems awkward or anxious. Pleasure, like sleep or confidence, tends to emerge indirectly, not through direct pursuit. The philosopher Henry Sidgwick first described the paradox, noting that happiness seems to arise more reliably when it is not the central goal. Pleasure is real, but it behaves strangely. It likes to appear as a side effect, not as a reward demanded on command. Activities such as creating art, forming friendship, working on meaningful problems, helping others, or learning something new often produce deep joy, but only because we focus on the activity, not the pleasure it yields. Another layer of the paradox involves expectation. When someone expects an experience to deliver happiness, the standard rises. If the pleasure does not immediately match the expectation, disappointment replaces joy. A vacation turns stressful because it should be perfect. A date feels pressured because it must be romantic. A hobby becomes less enjoyable when turned into. The pursuit of pleasure creates tension that kills. Psychologists call self-focused attention. When you constantly monitor your happiness, your mind becomes inward and narrow. This inward focus amplifies negative, minor discomfort. Small moment, the mind becomes an overact. Studying instead of experience. Pleasure cannot bloom. Another explanation that pleasure is not an object, but a byproduct of engagement. The best moments of joy often come when we are absorbed in something outside us, like losing track of time during a conversation, getting immersed in a musical performance, or focusing fully on a challenging task. In these moments, the self almost The pleasure is real, but it arrives naturally, without being. When we become preoccupied with obtaining pleasure, we interrupt that natural. The paradox also has a deeper moral dimension. Many philosophers argue that humans need meaning, purpose, and connection to feel truly fulfilled. Pleasure alone cannot sustain a satisfying life. When people prioritize only pleasure, they often neglect relationships, responsibility, and personal growth. This leads to emptiness rather than joy. The pursuit of pleasure becomes hollow because it lacks depth. Even in everyday life, hedonism often backfires. The person who chases thrills may feel restless. The person who pursues comfort may become bored. The person who avoids difficulty may become fragile. Real satisfaction often requires effort, discipline, and even discomfort. Pleasure grows best in the soil of challenge, purpose, and engagement. It is the fruit of meaningful living, not the goal of it. This does not mean pleasure is bad. Pleasure is an essential part of it. The paradox simply teaches us that pleasure cannot be commanded. It must be invited indirectly. The more we try to grab it directly, the more it slips away. Meno's paradox, sometimes called the paradox of inquiry, comes from an ancient dialogue between Socrates and Meno, recorded by Plato. It deals with a fundamental question about learning. How can we search for knowledge when we do not know what we are looking for? The paradox sounds simple at first, but it strikes at the heart of what it means to learn, discover, or even recognize truth. The paradox begins with Meno asking Socrates whether virtue can be taught. Instead of answering directly, Socrates turns the question around and challenges Meno's understanding of inquiry itself. Meno argues that learning seems impossible. If you already know something, you do not need to inquire about it. If you do not know something, you cannot inquire about it, because you would not recognize it even if you stumbled upon it. Inquiry seems trapped between two extremes, knowing and not knowing. There appears to be no path forward. Menno summarizes the problem in a sharp sentence. How will you search for something when you do not know what it is? If you do not know what virtue is, how can you search for it? And if you do find something, how can you be sure it is what you were looking for? This creates a paradox. Inquiry appears to require prior knowledge of what we are seeking, but if we already have that knowledge, inquiry becomes unnecessary. The paradox challenges the very foundation of learning. It suggests that discovery is impossible. It implies that humans can never move from ignorance to knowledge, because ignorance gives us no direction. It is like trying to navigate without a map, without a destination, and without even knowing what a destination looks like. Socrates responds to the paradox with a surprising idea. He claims that learning is not the creation of new knowledge, but the recollection of knowledge already within the soul. This theory of recollection suggests that the soul has encountered these truths before birth, and inquiry is the act of remembering them. Socrates demonstrates this idea by questioning a young slave boy about geometry. The boy, with no formal education, appears to discover geometrical truths through guided questioning alone. Socrates argues that the boy is remembering knowledge his soul already possessed. From a modern perspective, this explanation may feel mystical, but the deeper insight remains powerful. Learning occurs through active questioning, not through passive possession of information. The paradox forces us to reconsider what it means to not know. Complete ignorance, the total emptiness Menno describes, rarely exists in human life. In most inquiries, we have partial understanding, fragments of intuition, or a sense of what we are missing. Inquiry begins not from knowing nothing, but from recognizing the boundaries of our knowledge. In this sense, the paradox teaches that ignorance is not absolute. It has structure, it has edges, and those edges guide inquiry. When you do not know the answer to a question, you still know something about the kind of answer you are looking for. Even a child who asks, "What is that?" has a sense of category and expectation. Curiosity is possible because humans can sense that something is missing. Another way to understand the paradox is through goals. When you inquire about something, you often start with a vague idea. You may not know exactly what you want, but you have direction. You refine your understanding along the way. Inquiry becomes a process of shaping a cloudy intuition into clarity. This process contradicts Menno's strict division between knowing and not knowing. Real inquiry lives in the middle ground. Modern philosophers interpret Menno's paradox as a challenge to the idea that all knowledge comes from definitions. If we needed perfect definitions before starting inquiry, we could never begin. But inquiry itself helps us form better definitions. We learn by exploring, testing, refining, and revising our understanding. Knowledge grows from interaction, not from exactness at the start. The paradox also touches on self-improvement and personal growth. People often begin journeys of change, emotional, intellectual, spiritual, without fully knowing what they seek. They sense something missing, even if they cannot name it. The quest itself reveals the goal. This mirrors Socrates' idea that inquiry shapes knowledge. Ultimately, Menno's paradox shows that learning is possible because humans are capable of being aware of their ignorance. The awareness of not knowing becomes the first step toward knowing. Inquiry does not require full knowledge of the destination. It requires curiosity, openness, and the ability to recognize discovery when it appears. In the end, The paradox invites us to embrace uncertainty. It reminds us that learning is not a path with a clear map. It is a journey where each answer reveals new questions. It teaches that the mystery of inquiry is not a barrier. It is the very essence of how we grow, think, and understand the world. The repugnant conclusion is one of the most controversial ideas in moral philosophy, especially in the field of population ethics. It challenges our intuitions about what makes a world morally better. The paradox begins with a thought experiment. Imagine two possible worlds. In the first world, a relatively small number of people live extremely good lives, lives filled with deep happiness, fulfillment, and meaningful experiences. In the second world, there are many more people, billions more, but each person's life is only barely worth living. They have more suffering, fewer opportunities, and minimal happiness. But their lives are still, overall, just above the line of being not worth living. The paradox arises when we apply a certain kind of moral reasoning that tries to maximize total well-being. According to this reasoning, if you add more people who have lives worth living, the total amount of well-being increases. Even if each new life has only a tiny amount of happiness, adding billions of such lives eventually produces more total happiness than the smaller population with extremely happy people. If we follow this logic consistently, we end up concluding that the second world, with its huge population and low-quality lives, is morally better than the first world, which has fewer people living wonderful lives. This conclusion feels deeply wrong. That intuition that the result is disturbing or repugnant is what gives the paradox its name. The repugnant conclusion reveals a conflict between two powerful ideas. One idea is that creating more happy lives is good. The other idea is that the quality of life matters. When we combine these ideas within certain ethical frameworks, especially utilitarian ones, they push us toward a result that our moral intuition rejects. The paradox does not simply challenge mathematics, it challenges our understanding of value. The paradox becomes even sharper when we consider a chain of worlds. Start with a world of a few very happy people. Now imagine a slightly larger population with slightly less happiness, but where the total happiness is greater. It seems reasonable to say this second world might be better, because more happiness exists overall. Now repeat this step again and again. Population increases, average happiness decreases, but total happiness keeps rising. Eventually, we arrive at a world where everyone's life is barely positive. And yet, following the step-by-step logic, we are forced to say that this final world is better than the first. The journey looks reasonable, but the destination feels absurd. One reason the paradox is so powerful is that it reaches not just philosophers, but ordinary people. When we imagine living in the first world, it feels like a beautiful and fulfilling place. The second world feels overcrowded, impoverished, and joyless, even if technically no one's life is net negative. Our intuitions resist the idea that such a world could be morally preferable, simply because it contains more people. The paradox exposes a deep problem in how we compare worlds with different populations. In everyday morality, we rarely think about whether potential future people should count in our moral calculations. But population ethics forces us to address that question. How should we weigh the value of people who do not yet exist? Should we value quantity or quality? And if we try to value both, can we avoid contradictions? Some philosophers attempt to reject the conclusion by changing the way we measure well-being. They argue that average happiness matters more than total happiness. Under this view, a world with fewer but happier people is better than one with more people whose lives are barely tolerable. But this average view creates its own problems. For example, it suggests that adding a person with a good life could make the world worse if their life lowers the average slightly. Others propose that well-being should not be added up at all. Instead, they suggest focusing on thresholds. Lives must reach a certain quality level before counting as morally positive. But even this approach struggles when comparing worlds with extremely large populations. Some philosophers argue that the paradox reveals something profound. about human values. Our intuitions about large numbers break down. We can understand the difference between 10 happy lives and one miserable life. But when comparing billions of barely worthwhile lives to a smaller number of excellent lives, our intuition becomes less reliable. The repugnant conclusion also reflects the tension between personal morality and global or future-oriented morality. Caring about actual people feels intuitive. Caring about potential people feels abstract. The paradox forces us to confront whether more lives worth living is automatically good, or whether quality should always outweigh quantity. At its core, the repugnant conclusion teaches humility. It shows that ethical reasoning becomes incredibly complex when we deal with populations, future generations, or large-scale outcomes. It reminds us that moral principles that seem simple and attractive can lead to unsettling consequences when applied universally. And it encourages us to rethink how we define a good world, not only by the number of lives in it, but by the richness and dignity of each life. Hempel's black shoes paradox, also known as the paradox of confirmation, explores a strange and unsettling feature of how evidence supports scientific hypotheses. It begins with a simple statement: all ravens are black. This seems like a typical scientific hypothesis. To test it, you would look at ravens. If every raven you observe is black, your confidence in the hypothesis increases. If you find a white raven, the hypothesis collapses. So far, everything feels logical and intuitive. But the paradox appears when we restate the hypothesis in logically equivalent form. If something is not black, then it is not a raven. This is just another way of expressing the same idea. If all ravens are black, then anything that is not black cannot be a raven. The two statements mean exactly the same thing in logic. Now the strange part. If observing a black raven confirms the hypothesis, then observing something that is not black and not a raven should also confirm the hypothesis. For example, seeing a green apple, a blue pen, or a pair of red socks should count as evidence that all ravens are black. And even stranger, so should observing a pair of black shoes. Why? Because black shoes fit the logical pattern. They are not ravens, and they do not violate the rule: if something is not black, then it is not a raven. Therefore, seeing black shoes also confirms the hypothesis that all ravens are black. This idea seems absurd. Why should looking at your closet or noticing a green leaf increase your confidence in a scientific claim about ravens? How could millions of unrelated, everyday observations be considered valid evidence for a hypothesis about birds? This contradiction is the heart of Hempel's paradox. It shows that logic does not always align with intuition, and that the process of confirming hypotheses is far more complex than it first appears. To understand why this happens, consider that hypotheses often make claims about entire categories of objects. All ravens are black is a universal statement. It makes a claim about every raven in the universe. Logically, any object that does not violate the statement, whether it is a raven or not, fits into the set of evidence that suggests the statement might be true. If the hypothesis were false, then there would be at least one object that contradicts it. Specifically, there would be at least one non-black raven. So any object that is non-black but not a raven does not contradict the hypothesis. It fits neatly into the logical framework. That is why, logically speaking, a pair of black shoes, a yellow flower, or a white cloud all confirm the hypothesis. They are consistent with the rule. But intuition rebels. It feels wrong because these observations tell us nothing meaningful about ravens. They do not help us understand their color, biology, or behavior. They simply have no connection. This tension between logical consistency and scientific relevance is what makes the paradox so fascinating. One way philosophers try to resolve the paradox is by distinguishing between logical confirmation and informative confirmation. Logically, any consistent observation supports the hypothesis. But informative confirmation requires that the observation meaningfully increases our understanding of the subject. A black raven is informative, a green apple is not. Another approach argues that the paradox arises because universal claims cover enormous categories. Observing one non-black non-raven among billions does almost nothing to support the hypothesis. Mathematically, its impact on probability is tiny, so tiny that it becomes practically irrelevant. In contrast, observing an actual raven significantly narrows the possibilities. This explanation suggests that the paradox feels wrong because we intuitively grasp the difference in weight between relevant and irrelevant evidence. Some philosophers believe the paradox reveals a flaw in how we define confirmation. Instead of thinking that all consistent observations confirm a hypothesis, they argue that confirmation requires a connection between the observation and the hypothesis. Without that link, the observation may be logically consistent, but scientifically useless. Another interpretation is that the paradox shows that evidence does not function simply by logic. Context matters. The meaning behind the observation matters. Saying that black shoes confirm the hypothesis may be technically true in a strict logical sense, but it does not capture the way scientists actually evaluate evidence. Scientific reasoning requires more than bare logical consistency. It requires relevance, causation, and explanatory value. The paradox ultimately teaches us that reasoning about evidence is more subtle than it seems. Observations have different strengths, weights, and meanings depending on how they relate to the hypothesis. Logic alone cannot capture the full richness of scientific reasoning. The paradox also warns us that what appears obvious may hide deeper complexities. In the end, Hempel's black shoes paradox is not just about ravens or shoes. It is about the tricky relationship between logic, probability, and scientific understanding. It shows that evidence can mislead us when taken out of context, and that intuition sometimes reveals gaps that pure logic overlooks. The paradox encourages us to think more carefully about how we know what we think we know, and why something that is logically true may not always be practically meaningful. The paradox of intolerance explores a strange and uncomfortable idea. Intolerance often grows strongest in the very places where it is least expected. Intolerance does not always rise in societies that openly accept it. Instead, it often emerges and thrives in societies that believe they are completely free from it. This paradox suggests that the more confidently a society declares itself intolerant of intolerance, the more likely it is to behave intolerantly without realizing it. It becomes blind to its own contradictions. Its efforts to eliminate intolerance can lead to the very behavior it claims to fight. The paradox begins with a simple observation. People naturally see intolerance as something negative, something associated with prejudice, discrimination, or cruelty. So, when individuals or groups insist that they themselves are against intolerance, they see their moral stance as pure and justified. But this moral certainty can become dangerous. It can transform into a belief that their own intolerance is acceptable because it comes from the right motives. They believe they are intolerant only toward those who deserve it. This thinking creates a moral blind spot because they no longer recognize that intolerance is intolerance, no matter who expresses it. Imagine a community that prides itself on being inclusive. It says it supports diversity of thought and expression. But when someone expresses an idea the community dislikes, the community may react with hostility, shame, or exclusion. The people doing the excluding do not see their intolerance as intolerance. They see it as protecting values. They justify it by claiming that the other person is the real problem, the one who threatens the group's ideals. In this moment, the community becomes intolerant while believing it is still completely virtuous. This is the paradox. Intolerance hides itself inside the belief that one is intolerant only for good reasons. The paradox deepens when societies create strict rules about what counts as acceptable behavior or acceptable opinions. These rules often begin with the intention to prevent harm, but over time, the rules grow tighter and the definition of intolerant ideas becomes broader. Eventually, any disagreement, criticism, or difference of viewpoint can be labeled as dangerous. Once a society reaches this point, it begins to enforce ideological conformity. Those who do not fit the norm are pushed aside or silenced. The society has become intolerant in the name of protecting tolerance. This dynamic appears in many real situations. Students may demand that speakers with opposing views be banned from campuses. Activists may attack individuals online for expressing an unpopular opinion. Communities may expel members who do not perfectly mirror the group's beliefs. The intention is often to resist intolerance, but the outcome is a growing culture of fear, silence, and judgment. People begin to hide their views. Conversations become shallow, honesty becomes risky, and intolerance spreads quietly, disguised as a moral duty. Another part of the paradox is psychological. Humans tend to see their own group as righteous and other groups as problematic. When people believe they are morally correct, they become less likely to question their behavior. They may enforce their views aggressively, convinced they are protecting goodness. Meanwhile, the intolerance they direct toward others feels justified. This creates a loop where both sides see themselves as victims of the other's intolerance. Each side becomes more rigid, more defensive, and more hostile. The paradox shows how quickly intolerance multiplies when mixed with certainty. There is also a deeper philosophical layer. Intolerance is not simply a rejection of ideas. It is a refusal to see the humanity of those who hold them. The paradox reminds us that intolerance does not disappear when we declare it unacceptable. It reappears in new forms. It changes its shape. It hides behind moral language. It turns into a weapon used by people who believe they cannot possibly be wrong because they stand on the side of virtue. Solving the paradox is not easy. Some argue that intolerance must always be opposed directly, even if doing so risks becoming intolerant. Others argue that too much policing of intolerance creates a rigid, fearful culture. The truth may lie somewhere in between. A healthy society needs boundaries to protect people from harm, but it also needs humility, awareness, and a willingness to self-reflect. It must recognize that even good intentions can become oppressive if left unchecked. The paradox of intolerance teaches that intolerance grows where people believe they cannot possibly be intolerant. It warns that moral certainty can make us blind to our own behavior. It encourages conversations instead of silencing, curiosity instead of judgment, and boundaries that protect without suffocating. Above all, it reminds us that the fight against intolerance must include watching ourselves, not just watching others. Newcomb's paradox is one of the most famous puzzles in decision theory. It forces us to confront a clash between two powerful ways of thinking, the logic of prediction and the logic of free choice. At the center of the paradox are two boxes, a highly accurate predictor and a decision that seems straightforward but leads to intense philosophical disagreement. The setup is simple. You walk into a room and see two boxes, Box A, which is transparent and contains $1,000, and Box B, which is opaque and may contain either $1 million or nothing. A powerful and almost perfectly accurate predictor, sometimes imagined as a superintelligent AI, has already made a prediction about what you will choose. The rules are these. If the predictor predicted that you will take only Box B, then it placed $1 million inside it. If the predictor predicted that you will take both boxes, then it left Box B empty. The predictor never changes its mind after the prediction is made. Now you must make your choice. Do you take both boxes, or do you take only the opaque box? At first, the choice seems obvious. You can see $1,000 in Box A. You might as well take it. If Box B contains $1 million, you get both sums. which seems even better. If box B is empty, at least you walk away with $1,000. This strategy is called two-boxing, and it feels like common sense. After all, your action now cannot possibly change what is already inside box B. The predictor has already made its decision, but another line of reasoning leads to the opposite conclusion. The predictor is known to be extremely accurate, perhaps 99.9% correct, or even effectively perfect. If you choose only box B, it almost certainly predicted that, and therefore the $1 million is waiting for you. If you take both boxes, it almost certainly predicted that too, and box B will be empty. So one boxing gives you a near guaranteed million, whereas two boxing leaves you with a small sum and the likelihood of losing the million altogether. The paradox emerges because two compelling principles clash. One principle says, your current action cannot change the past. Box B already contains what it contains. Taking an extra $1,000 cannot affect what the predictor did earlier. The other principle says, your action is evidence of the predictor's earlier prediction. If you choose only box B, that strongly suggests the predictor predicted this and placed the million inside. If you choose both, it strongly suggests the predictor predicted that and left the box empty. Both arguments appear logically sound, yet they lead to opposite decisions. Philosophers, economists, and mathematicians have debated this paradox for decades, and no consensus exists. The paradox becomes even richer when we consider how people choose based on different philosophical principles. Supporters of two-boxing use causal decision theory, which focuses on what actions cause in the future. Two-boxers argue that taking both boxes does not cause the predictor to change the past. Since the money is already placed, the rational move is to take all available money. On the other side are supporters of one-boxing, who use evidential decision theory, which asks what your choice indicates about the world. One-boxers argue that your choice is evidence of the predictor's earlier action. Choosing only box B is strongly correlated with getting the $1 million. Choosing both correlates with getting much less. The paradox forces us to confront difficult questions about free will. Did you freely choose? Or did the predictor anticipate everything, including your reasoning? If the predictor is almost infallible, then the moment you decide to two-box, that decision is essentially proof that the million is not there. You think you are choosing freely, but your choice might simply be following the path the predictor already saw. Another layer concerns self-reference. The predictor's accuracy depends on modeling you, including your personality, your habits, your reasoning style, and even your reaction to the paradox. Your decision becomes entangled with the predictor's prediction in a loop that challenges the boundary between past and future. Some interpretations suggest the paradox reveals that human decision-making is not purely about maximizing outcomes, but about understanding how choices reflect information. Others see the paradox as evidence that free will may be limited, or that perfect prediction undermines traditional decision logic. In everyday life, Newcomb's paradox resembles situations where our actions signal our character or intentions. Commitment, trust, and cooperation often work like one boxing. Acting as if you believe in a beneficial outcome can help create it. On the other hand, opportunistic thinking resembles two-boxing, trying to maximize immediate gains without trust. The paradox highlights the tension between strategic thinking and believing in constructive patterns. Ultimately, Newcomb's paradox teaches us that rationality is not always simple. Two different types of reasoning, causal and evidential, can lead to completely opposite conclusions, each internally consistent. It invites us to rethink what it means to choose freely, and how deeply our decisions are intertwined with the expectations of others. And it reminds us that even the simplest choices can become complex when prediction, probability, and reasoning collide. The paradox of triggers explores a psychological contradiction that appears in conversations about trauma, sensitivity, emotional safety, and personal growth. A trigger is something, an image, idea, memory, or situation that evokes distress or reactivates past trauma. The paradox arises when attempts to avoid triggers eventually make a person more sensitive to them, not less. The very effort to protect oneself from discomfort can strengthen the power of the discomfort. What is avoided becomes harder to face, and what is feared becomes louder in the mind. The paradox suggests that avoiding triggers is both necessary for healing and potentially harmful if taken too far. The paradox begins with a basic truth. Triggers overwhelm the nervous system. They can cause panic, sadness, flashbacks, anxiety, or emotional shutdown. For people healing from trauma, avoiding triggers can be essential in early stages of recovery. It prevents re-traumatization, protects emotional stability, and gives the brain space to calm down. This kind of avoidance is healthy and even life-saving. The mind needs time to regain strength before facing difficult material. But the paradox appears when avoidance becomes the main strategy for handling distress. The more frequently someone avoids a trigger, the more threatening the trigger begins to feel. The brain learns that the trigger is dangerous, and each act of avoidance reinforces that belief. A trigger that might originally be manageable becomes larger and more overwhelming in the person's imagination. This is because the brain treats avoidance as proof that danger is real. The protective behavior, intended to reduce suffering, ends up making the trigger appear more powerful. Over time, the person may become sensitive to smaller and smaller triggers. The emotional boundary shrinks. Everyday experiences start to feel unsafe. Even neutral or harmless situations can provoke stress. The individual becomes caught in a loop. The more they avoid discomfort, the more discomfort grows. This is the core of the paradox. What feels safe in the short term becomes limiting in the long term. The paradox also appears in social contexts. In communities or institutions where trigger warnings and strict avoidance practices are used extensively, people may feel protected at first. They appreciate the effort to create emotional safety. But as avoidance increases, tolerance decreases. People begin to expect complete protection from upsetting ideas or emotions. When the outside world inevitably violates that expectation, they feel even more overwhelmed. A system designed to reduce suffering unintentionally increases emotional fragility. Psychologists observe a similar pattern in anxiety disorders. Avoiding anxiety-provoking situations provides instant relief, but the relief acts like a trap. The mind never has the opportunity to learn that the situation might be survivable. Without exposure to discomfort, the nervous system does not gain resilience. This is why exposure therapy, gently facing triggers with support, can help reduce distress over time. By slowly encountering what feels threatening, the brain rewrites its beliefs about danger. Paradoxically, facing triggers decreases their power. However, the paradox should not be misunderstood. It does not suggest that people should recklessly confront their worst triggers without support. That can cause real psychological harm. The paradox highlights a balance, protecting oneself enough to heal, yet not avoiding discomfort so completely that healing becomes impossible. The goal is not to eliminate triggers, but to reduce their control. Another layer of the paradox concerns identity. Sometimes, people begin to define themselves by their triggers. They see themselves primarily as fragile, wounded, or easily harmed. While this identity can feel validating at first, it can also limit growth. The more someone sees themselves as breakable, the more breakable they feel. The mind becomes trapped in its own protective storytelling. This identity-based avoidance reinforces fear and reduces confidence. There is also a social feedback loop. When others constantly adjust their behavior to avoid triggering someone, The person may feel temporarily safe, but ultimately more dependent. Their emotional well-being becomes contingent on the environment never changing. This places tremendous pressure on both the individual and the community. The paradox reveals that we cannot create a world without triggers. We can only build the capacity within ourselves to navigate them more skillfully. The paradox of triggers ultimately teaches a subtle truth. Emotional safety is not created solely by eliminating distress, but by developing resilience toward it. Healing requires gentleness, patience, and support, but also gradual contact with discomfort. Avoidance soothes the moment, but strengthens the fear. Engagement feels scary, but can weaken the fear over time. The paradox invites a balanced approach. It encourages compassion for people who struggle with triggers, while also reminding us that empowerment grows through careful exposure, not perfect protection. It shows that resilience is not the absence of triggers, but the ability to face them without losing ourselves. And it reveals that healing is not a straight line. It is a dance between shelter and challenge, protection and growth. The absent-minded driver paradox is a striking puzzle in decision theory that explores what happens when a person must make a choice without remembering where they are, and without knowing if the moment they are in is the one that matters. The paradox reveals deep problems about rational choice when memory, awareness, and uncertainty collapse together. It forces us to rethink what it means to choose well when we don't know which decision we're standing at. The story begins with a driver who must take a highway home. He is tired, distracted, and prone to forgetfulness. On this highway, there are two exits. The first exit leads to a dangerous neighborhood, undesirable and worth very little to him. The second exit leads home, a valuable and ideal outcome. If the driver misses both exits, the road eventually loops back and sends him into a long, costly detour that wastes significant time and energy. The problem is that the driver knows ahead of time that he will be absent while driving. When he reaches an exit, he will not remember where the second exit. He cannot distinguish between them while on the road. He cannot rely on memory because the moment he needs it, his memory fails. He is aware of his own future forgetfulness. This alone creates the paradox. He must create a strategy now will apply later, even though later he will not know where. Before the trip begins, the driver reasons about the possible strategies he could use. One strategy is to always exit whenever he sees a ramp, no matter what. If he does this, he will take the first exit, which is bad, but he will avoid missing both exits and the costly detour. Another strategy is to never exit, hoping that eventually he will reach the second exit by staying on. But since he cannot tell the exits apart, he ends up driving past both exits and falling into the long detour. A third strategy is to randomize, exit with a certain probability each time he sees a ramp. But even this randomness becomes difficult to evaluate because he cannot condition his choice on knowing which ramp he is seeing. The paradox becomes most apparent when we compare two modes of reasoning, state-based reason and act-based reason. State-based reason asks, what should the driver do? What should he do at the second exit? Clearly, he should avoid the first exit and take the second exit. But state-based reasoning is useless to the driver because in the moment he reaches an exit, he cannot distinguish. He does not know which scenario. State-based logic collapses. Act-based reasoning instead asks, what action should the driver take when he sees an exit ramp? Given that he does not know what it is, in this mode, he must choose one general exit or don't exit, and here the paradox emerges. The act that seems optimal in each specific situation is not optimal. He must choose a single rule for both. If he chooses always to exit, he loses out on the best outcome, but avoids disaster, the long detour. If he chooses never to exit, he guarantees the worst outcome. If he chooses a probability, say exits 60% of the time, then he might exit the first ramp by chance or miss both ramps entirely, but his decision becomes a calculation under radical uncertainty. Rationality becomes tangled. He cannot attach his action to the correct. Another surprising twist is that sometimes the mathematically optimal strategy is not the one the driver wants. In many versions of the paradox, the rational expected value is to exit with a probability between 50% and 70% each exit, meaning the driver accepts that he might enter the bad neighborhood at the first exit, because this randomness increases the chance he eventually reaches. This feels irrational. Why would a person deliberately choose a strategy that knowingly brings them to a bad location, yet mathematically it maximizes all expected? The paradox teaches several lessons. First, rational decision-making breaks down when memory or self-awareness is unreliable. A strategy that seems optimal under perfect knowledge becomes ineffective when a person cannot identify the moment they are in. Second, the paradox shows that some decisions require planning at a higher level than the immediate moment. The driver must choose a rule for future states, even though future states cannot be identified. Third, it highlights that rationality is sometimes forward-looking rather than situational. What seems irrational in one moment becomes rational across time. Most importantly, the absent-minded driver paradox reveals that knowledge of future ignorance can shape present decisions. The driver's awareness that he will forget is part of the problem itself. One cannot simply choose in the moment, because the moment will hide itself. In the end, the paradox invites us to see how fragile rationality can be when information is incomplete. It shows that even simple choices become tangled when awareness, memory, and uncertainty collide. And it reminds us that sometimes the hardest part of choosing wisely is not the choice itself, but the inability to know where we stand.